Welcome to Hudson RPO's podcast on racial equality and diversity. Hear from Hudson RPO leaders as they encourage organizations to just start on their D&I journey.
All right, we're back at Just Start. I'm Jeremiah Stone, and joining me, as always, are Gary Jones, Casey Butler, and Mark Rogers, talking about our Just Start journey. And as part of that, I wanted to throw to Mark, as he just actually shared an interesting story that speaks to one of the things that we want to talk about today, which is that after you sort of are engaged in this active listening with the folks around you and around the topic of racial equity in the workforce, how do you then sort of push past the discomfort to have sort of more evolved conversations around that actually change the lens that we're approaching this topic? So, Mark, I thought it was an interesting story, and I'd be interested if you'd share it with us.
Sure. Yeah, it's perfect timing because what else would I have talked about? I'm not sure today what example, but perfect timing. And as I was engaged in the dialogue with an external candidate, senior executive, who is looking for his next career opportunity, white male. And we got on the topic of, diversity. We didn't really talk so much about some of the topics that we've talked about, George Floyd and such, but it kind of edged in that direction towards the end of the dialogue. But his question to me was, and when he asked the question, I kind of smiled. It was an audio, call. And I kind of smiled to myself as, I'm just like, wow, I hadn't thought about this in the months following, George Floyd and all the unrest and everything that's going on. But his question was, as a white male, is now a bad time for me to be looking for my next career opportunity? And so my initial response was kind of a smirk and a smile, and just kind of thinking, well, I don't know that there's ever been categorically a bad time for white males in the workforce, on the job market, exclusively because you're white male. Maybe other extenuating circumstances within the market, but not exclusively because of that. But now here we are, where I think folks are hypersensitive to what's happening in the world and how that's translating into what's happening in the corporate world and in the job market. So as I'm talking through my thoughts on that, and my thoughts were, employers are currently focused on the recruitment of people of color. I see a bit of a shift in kind of the focus, and it's more broadening on other aspects of diversity, which I expected to naturally happen. But as I'm answering and giving him my thinking around, his question, I instantly thought about the three of you and thought, okay, I want to know what Gary, Jeremiah, and Casey think about this and how you guys would answer that question. So I tactfully tried to have the conversation, but I also tried to have a frank conversation, and we've been talking about that, and I think that's happening more. But I would love to get your perspective on that question, and and what you think about him asking that.
Yeah, I think I can weigh in on it. The first thing I thought about when you gave the example is wow, when I think about this, a certain time ago, would he have even asked that question? So I think that this day and age, it's to the forefront of everyone's mind. So we talk about listening, we talk about sharing the previous podcast, and now this one. I think it's great that he shared what his thoughts are, and is because again, it's another elephant in the room that we talked about, whether it be comfortable, whether it be uncomfortable, whether it be agreed or disagree. It's communication and talking. So the fact that he shared that with you, Mark, I think is an example of the sense of urgency and advancement that's happened across the country because of these issues. But again, I know some people may not agree with that, right, in terms of that, and think that that's a short-sighted look at things. But the fact that he brought that to your attention and asked about those types of things, I think his perception is just as important as others to really have the opportunity to listen and give some education or backdrop where needed. So that's my thought on it. I love the fact that he shared it with you. I think that it's an example of us listening and being able to answer and
Yeah,
not
I
judge.
wasn't. And by the way, I wasn't off put by the question per se as much as I was, more surprised about it.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I don't know why, because more and more candidates and those questions are being asked. Some of those topics that you don't really talk about, like we talk about culture and things like that, and there are now some really frank questions about, well, okay, internally, is your strategy, is your focus on diverse, do you feel it's genuine, and what are all the things you're doing? There's a lot of frankness in the conversation that's being had. But Casey, interested in in your thoughts.
Yeah, I was thinking the same thing. Brought me back to the fact that how you must have made him feel comfortable to be able to share that, because I don't know that everybody would have felt comfortable actually telling you what they were thinking in that moment. So I think, you must have set a really good framework with him to be able for him to feel comfortable to speak openly with you and ask you questions that, that he may not have felt comfortable asking someone else. And I, like Gary, I thought, wow, I don't think he would have asked that question, months ago. And it's good that people are starting to think about things differently. The way they see things, I think, are different. And, I think it's just the start. Jeremiah, you had made an interesting comment when Gary shared before about, your thoughts on the initial question.
Yeah, look, I think the good is definitely that it seems like he pushed through some discomfort to ask a question that was actually weighing on his mind, which we need people to do more of that, I suppose. And Mark obviously pushed through some discomfort in replying to a very pointed question. But implicit in the question for me, like the concerning thing is like what seems to be an expectation that things will return to normal, right? Like right now the focus is on people of color, and if I wait it out long enough, like it'll come back to me.
Yeah.
And I think the challenge for all of us in actually like making sure this moment is different from the moments that came before is once we just start to keep going and keep pushing and keep going on that journey and keep pushing through discomfort and keep challenging ourselves. And actually, Casey, you had shared an example earlier of a recent team call that you were a part of, where somebody sort of talked about that process of learning and unlearning and how they've sort of taken control of that narrative and are looking to move forward with some of those learnings. So we'd be interested for you to share that with us.
Yeah, I would love to. And just before I do that, I think this day and age, we even said our Just Start started as maybe we're going to start with three podcasts for this, but we've all agreed that's not enough, right? And so I think that links, Jeremiah, to what you were saying about, this is not just a moment in time. We have to make sure this is moving forward, the moment, all the time. And so, I think we've realized that even with our podcast, we thought, okay, this is what we're going to start, but we're like, we're not done yet. This is, the start of the series, but we're not done. We have more work to do. So I think that's important. But my particular story is around, we had pulled together a group of recruiters to talk about some training that our recruiters received through Social Talent, great platform. And with everything that's going on in the world, one of our recruiters took the interviewing bias training and really shared an amazing story about applying what she had learned. And so she had shared that cultural fit was one of the terms that they had warned to be wary of, that it could cause some bias. And she thought back to, the number of candidates. I mean, I can only imagine thousands and thousands of candidates that she had interviewed, and she had accepted the fact that, they weren't the right cultural fit. And she asked the group, because it was a group call, to say, how could I do it differently now? Now that I know that cultural fit could be me being biased against somebody by using that term, how can I do it differently? And some of the conversation was, don't refer back to the job description. Don't compare candidates. And so she had committed on that call to using the new things that she had learned moving forward, and to report back, in our next call to tell us how successful that was going. And so the group was really open to hearing what she had to say. I think it was really relevant. I actually had said back in back when I was in the beginning of my recruiting career, I had taken a course on, it was actually a video called More Than a Gut Feeling about interviewing. And they had said, the whole point about interviewing is not to go with your gut. It's to validate what you think and feel is accurate by asking questions. And so I think that was something that she was planning on using moving forward.
Yeah, I think that's a really powerful, concept when you think about, diversity and inclusion. I think we all grew up as recruiters earlier in career where the cultural fit piece was something, if in addition to looking at the capabilities for the role, was something that, as I reflect, was often used as a knockout factor. So I like the idea of getting away from that cultural fit conversation and talking about things like cultural complement. I think that's where this really has to go. Jeremiah, you look like you were about to say something, but I'm curious to, we were talking about, keeping things moving along and keeping the momentum. We've seen a lot of companies hire people of color in these diversity heads, positions, and I'm a little weary of that. And I'm curious. I'm very, very weary of that. And I know we didn't talk about this beforehand, but it just your comment, Casey, made me reflect on, as I look at my LinkedIn feed and I see announcement after announcement after announcement of person of color who's excited to be appointed to Chief Diversity Officer, Head of Global Diversity and Inclusion. Oh, by the way, equity's often not in that. At least not implicitly in the nomenclature. I'm curious, what others think. Are you as weary of what you're seeing and a little skeptical as I am? Because I got to tell you, I'm very skeptical based on the fade that I'm seeing as far as the energy, the engagement of executives on this topic, and the lack of commentary that I saw in March being present today in September, soon to be October.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree. And I think it's part of a general issue that's bigger than just the Chief Diversity Officer issue, which is that the responsibility for building a diverse workforce is often placed on people who are themselves diverse. Mm-hmm. So, meaning like, if there's a requirement that there is diverse representation on an interview panel, as an example, if you don't already have a diverse company, that means that there's going to be a lot of people spending a lot of time doing interviewing instead of doing their day job. So you're further burdening people of color and other diverse people with the responsibility for building a diverse workforce, when in point of fact, it is the responsibility of the non-diverse people, or the white males and others like them, to actually do that work of building a diverse workforce. And I think when you put somebody in a Chief Diversity Officer role and it's a person of color or other diverse person, and you think like, okay, that person's going to solve diversity for me, back to doing what I did before. Mm-hmm. Like that's where there's a challenge. When that person is like really empowered and that the executive that hires that person understands that they are responsible for that person's success, then I think you can potentially have a different outcome. But too often, I feel like people are placing the responsibility for building a diverse workforce onto diverse people, and it just further, burdens their time and means that they have less time to devote to the sort of glamour activities that will actually get them noticed, promoted, and so forth. So right. That's just my thought. Curious what others might think about Mark's question.
No, I would agree. I think that it's a microcosm example of why issues in our country didn't work before, right? In terms of racial issues, and when we had racial issues, it was people of color, minorities, the impacted, to stand up for themselves, right, and to be noticed, and to make sure this country understands the importance of equality. And that's why I think that this is a little bit different in terms of our country, in terms of everyone now. It seems more and more individuals that are not diverse individuals. We have more white males, individuals that are putting it on them to say, hey, this is a whole country problem. This is a systemic issue, and I am a part of the solution. It's the only way it can be done. And the same thing is happening in that example. Is hey, let's put a person of color and let them solve our diversity issues. And I think that you're exactly right, Jeremiah. I think that until the accountability is placed across all of those particular positions, regardless, and to have a comprehensive, eclectic type of effort. I do think that it's leading into the same issue, and I think it actually lessens the. I think what happens is if you perceive it as I think it's almost like, hey, this person got this job because they were diverse. This person is in this, and it actually lessens the importance of what they're trying to do, and it continues to build a larger divide. Now, I'm not saying that no minorities, diverse people should be hired in those positions, but that should not be the prerequisite of obviously the decision making in that thing. But anyway, those are my thoughts on that.
Mm.
Yeah, look, I think it has to be both and, right? Like,
Mhm.
that's one office, and like, absolutely, it's as with any other role, diverse people can and should be considered for those positions, and should be empowered to be successful in those positions. And I think, that's part of what we're talking about is how do we change the paradigm from just having a topic of diversity being like its own discipline to being the entirety of the business considers diversity.
Mm-hmm.
And so just I guess we have a few minutes left here. I did want to just in closing, and I realize that I take up space here, and I want to make sure that when I do so, it's for good reason, and I hope that there's some learning that folks can derive from what I say. And I wanted to share just in my own journey, wrapping up our initial Just Start conversation. One thing that I have, one way in which I have changed and will continue to operate this way moving forward. Excuse me. When I shortly after the murder of George Floyd, I, as many others, felt really strongly that I needed to say something to my team, which is a diverse team, which does include many people of color. And I had once read an article about a woman who came to work after the massacre at the AME church back in the Obama years, and she came into the office and had experienced this real and personal trauma as a consequence of that event, and everyone around her, every white person in the office, sort of carried on as if that was a normal day, right? Like sat there, normal chit chat. No one acknowledged this really traumatic event that had happened. And I certainly didn't want to be party to that kind of situation. So I thought it was important that I send a note, and I sent a strong note, and I sent a note that really spoke to the pain that I felt, but also the pain that the extraordinary pain that I understood that the people of color on my team were feeling in that moment. And I thought I wrote a pretty damn good note, if I'm saying so myself, because I'm me and I'm an egotist, and of course. But so I was like, I asked my partner, who's a man of color, and not because you should put this work on people of color, but because he kindly volunteered to be that filter for me. Like, can you just read this before I send it out to my team? And he looked at it and he read it and he said, I get what you're trying to do here, but I think it needs to be better. And I was, again, initially sort of confronted by that. But I realized that I had done the same thing that we always do when things like that happen, where you sort of talk about them in general terms. You try not to offend anyone, like who are you even offending at this point, and not really speaking to what had actually happened. So just to clarify on that, like I had written, in light of recent events or something like that, instead of saying following the murder of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and too many others, like I didn't speak it. And so if you're not speaking it, you're not solving it. So if you take nothing else from the podcast and from the discussion that we're all having, it's that you need to talk about things in open, honest terms. You need to be bold. You need to be not afraid to be politically incorrect or to be too politically correct or to step on people's toes. Like, people are ready to have this conversation, and we're not going to move forward unless we do.
Mm-hmm.
So
that's great.
Yeah. Well said. Well said. Well said.
Courage
Embrace
and
it.
discomfort.
Go ahead,
Courage and discomfort. To me, two key words and takeaways from our podcast. Be courageous and don't be afraid of discomfort.
Yeah, and I would say my comment on the appointments of chief diversity officers and heads of diversity, while I am a little leery of that, I am really pleased to see, to Gary's point earlier, just the broader engagement on the subject, directly, specifically on, the impact of inequality, for Black people, and others in the workforce and in the workplace. So I am pleased to see that mantle has been picked up beyond us, and I'm just hopeful that that focus continues and we don't get distracted by whatever is the next big thing to come.
Absolutely. And I think that, we talked about creating a comfortable environment, an official environment for people to actually talk about experiences, what they're feeling. But I want to say, be prepared for your unsolicited sharing, because that's the result of this. And again, embrace those conversations, as Mark did, with, individual talking and think, even if you disagree or don't agree, what you should look at is the intent, right? And know that, anything that we're talking about, it's education, it's discovery, it's advancement, it's progression. So embrace those conversations. There should be a lot of unsolicited sharing if the environment that you're creating works. And again, they're going to be uncomfortable in some particular cases, but nevertheless, it is a sign of progress. So keep that in mind and be prepared for that.
Well, speaking of environments that works, I love this one. I look forward to it every week. It was great chatting to you guys as always. As always, Gary Jones, Casey Butler, Mark Rogers, we are wrapping up our first 3 podcasts, but more to come. And thanks for listening to us prattle on.
Absolutely.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Cheers, guys.
Stay safe.
Cheers.
Bye-bye.
To speak with any of today's participants about your Just Start journey, email juststart@hudsonrpo.com.